Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're about 1 minute early, so we'll just give some time for people to log in. I hope you're having a great morning, afternoon, wherever you're joining in from. In fact, if you are joining in and you want to put in the chat where you're logging in from, that would be great. We're always happy to hear. I'll just start it off myself. Greetings from Venice, Italy. Dr. Winfried, good afternoon. Are you in the UK today? We've already got some people lively chatting in here. So we'll just give them a few more seconds. For those of you that are joining us, we're starting right on time today, 9 a.m. EST in Boston, 3 p.m. here in Venice, Italy. And we're delighted that you all have the opportunity to join us. Please keep your comments rolling in. We are monitoring those, and this is going to be very interactive. So we will be using the comments not only to say where we're logging in from, but it's delightful to see Atlanta, west coast of Norway, Geneva, Switzerland, London, England. Just a wonderful multicultural and multinational group here today. But we're also going to be using this for questions. So your comments that come in, those will be used to drive the conversation. It gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce today Donald Hawthorne. Now, Donald is a 6-time CEO. He's a graduate of Stanford Business School. We won't hold that against him. He's a hell of a great guy and a long-term partner at Strategy Tools. And he's been working on go-to-market for more years than LinkedIn is in existence. And we'll leave it at that. I just want to start out and note, 72% of all product and service launches fail. And Donald and I have gone back and forth on this number quite a bit because whenever you see statistics like that, you're like, that's not really the case, but it is. And we have some reliable sources. So more than 7 out of every 10 go-to-market initiatives fails. And what we'd like you to do is be able to improve this statistic. And with that, I'm not going to say much more. Scott Newton, managing partner at Thinking Dimensions. I'm going to turn it over to Donald and say good morning, and let's talk about go-to-market strategy and what we should all be doing. Hi, Donald.
Hey, good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad we could spend this time together. Let's talk about what go-to-market is not first, because I think that will help us clarify, because there's frequently different understandings of what it means. First off, it's not commercialization. It's not what you're doing 6 to 12 months prior to product launch and everything thereafter. And that is especially relevant in a world today where we have a lot of SaaS companies talking about GTM. It's also not planning, or even some people call it strategic planning, and it's not a destination. So what it is it's a situation on the hard side where you are upfront defining a customer value creation, where you show that you can deliver value to them. And that's the value hypothesis. And then it goes from there to saying, how do we scale? And that becomes the growth hypothesis. It's those combination of things that allow companies to create customers. And from a mindset side, the soft side, if you will, what it is it's the ability to have an openness, a recognition that it's a dynamic journey, because the marketplace is itself dynamic, and there's all sorts of uncertainty in the marketplace that you have to deal with not only now, but in the future.
So, Donald, we have so much talk in the press about go-to-market, and there's this back and forth about the hard side and the soft side. I'm going to start with a question, and it's quite general. Why does go-to-market matter? And what makes a great company in go-to-market in your experience?
So it's a great question, because part of what started me on this whole go-to-market journey was the idea that the question of why are there not more great companies? And you sit there and you say, okay, it's not for lack of executive ambition or intelligence, a lack of capital, technology, or ideas. Something is missing. And what I concluded some years ago is that what's missing is getting go-to-market properly understood right. So then the question becomes, well, why does that matter? How is that relevant? If you're building a great company, you're going to deliver dominant valuations and operating performance to the marketplace. And the parties, the third parties that are going to determine your valuation and operating performance are investors, corporate partners, and customers. And here's the really important point. The companies have no control over any of those three groups. And that means that executives are in the persuasion business. And if you're in the persuasion business, you have to offer them something that compels them to invest, partner, or buy. And I'm going to argue that GTM, properly understood, robust GTM strategies are the means for that persuasion.
Yeah, thank you, Donald. And in your experience, what do the exemplars do? I mean, how do they make this work so that it's not just a slogan or another PowerPoint deck from a management consultancy?
Yes, we've all seen too many of those, haven't we? and we all sort of tune them out just when they throw the first slide up. The things that they do well at a fundamental business level is they keep asking the question, what problems are we solving for whom? And so getting go-to-market right, step one, is have we identified unmet needs, customer unmet needs, and rigorously defined them? The second part of getting go-to-market right is that we have an agreement among the management team inside of the company on what those problems are. And then the third part is where we can then pivot to, okay, with that understanding and agreement, now we can get on with solving those needs by developing meaningful products.
You know, that sounds quite easy in practice or in theory, but in practice, how do we really make this work? If you can maybe, do you want to share that slide you have and we can start to go into a bit of detail on this?
Sure. So as part of this journey I've been on, what I did is I developed the GTM roadmap, which I call the persuasion framework. And it's got three fundamental elements to it. One is the product market fit, which is the question that addresses the point of how are we delivering something to the marketplace that people are desperate for because there are no good alternatives. Then you have business model fit, which is how do you deliver something that is both profitable and scalable to the company while enticing to customers. And then in the middle, you've got the glue that holds those two pieces together, and that's the organizational fit, which is the mindset, the behaviors, the habits of the management team and the employees as you then live and breathe the first two. So what you've got under product market fit is you've got the question of how do we know what the unmet customer needs are? And do we have agreement on those? And then secondly, have we identified the critical assumptions that have to be true for this effort to be successful? And does that lead to more than a ho-hum value proposition? Do we have something that's compelling where people say, I have to have that? That would be a key starting point. And then the mindset side, Scott, that I find so important. You know, I've been reading a bunch of stuff by some great thought leaders around the globe over years here. And one of the best I've read is the Christensen Gregerson's Innovators DNA, where they talk about the constant and regular asking of questions. And you go out there and then you dig into things, you seek deeper understandings, and then you bring it all together with some associational thinking with your colleagues. So that's a core mindset that I think is really important among the exemplary companies. And complementing that, above that, you have the external inflection points. So stuff's going on in the marketplace that you have no control over. Are you staying on top of that? Are you seeing what trends are happening so that you can make sure you act in response to them so you can capture upside opportunities or avoid the destruction of existing value with downside risks? And then finally, in the internal checkpoints, it's the idea of when you know what some of the assumptions are you doing them in a step-by-step fashion where you check and see, okay, we thought this was going to be true. Did it turn out to be true? Yes. Okay, let's proceed as planned. No, let's rethink what we do next and go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Donald. Just a question, and then we can, when you want, we can also turn the slide off. But when we think about GTM, there are some blind spots And those blind spots, in some cases, I think in your language, turn into black holes. What are those classic blind spots? And what should both a management team and a board do to avoid them?
Well, I go back to something that Jim Collins wrote in Good to Great. And what he talked about was disciplined people with disciplined thoughts and disciplined actions. And so on the management habit side, it's having bad mental models and habits that lead to following conventional wisdom, that lead to the kind of failure statistics that you mentioned at the very top of this LinkedIn Live event. And so what that leads to is a failure to ask hard questions, which is a common habit. You just don't dig deeply enough into like what's really going on. And what I've seen, because I've lived this, I mean, remember, I've held 12 C-suite positions over the years. I've lived this that I talk about. And so it's personal, it's real. And the thing that happens is you're busy. You're constantly busy. You've got a to-do list that's this long. You've got a plan, which, plans are not strategies. They're not GTM strategies. They are stuff under your control at the company. And so you're constantly executing against these plans. And so you never actually stop. You've equated planning with strategy. You're not asking the hard questions. And what that means is there's a lack of curiosity and humility that's really kind of striking. I mean, when you've got 70+% failure rates, my goodness, you should be filled with all sorts of humility because, you're all smart, but, are you smart enough to be in the 30% or the 70%? And you need to keep asking that because it's a dynamic market and there's no guarantees. And so Scott, you and I've had this conversation about whether it's pro sports here. I tend to think of hear stories about the NFL, when American football, when collegiates from top programs, and it can be true in hockey or soccer as well, they get up to the major leagues, the pro leagues, and all of a sudden the game is so much faster. And so what happens is they talk about how by the second year the game begins to slow down and you can achieve mastery. So my encouragement on the mental model problem is think about getting your GTM strategy thinking much more rigorous. Stop being too busy. Stop equating planning with strategy so you can begin to see the game slow down. And then what that'll mean is that from a hard edge, business side, it means that your customer unmet needs will become defined instead of ill-defined, because we were talking about black holes and blind spots and black holes, and you haven't defined your customer critical assumptions. You haven't got a value proposition that just knocks the socks off, where, as one Silicon Valley VC said, you go to take your prototype out of their office and they reach across the table and, figuratively speaking, grab your shirt collars and say, no, you can't have it. That's when you've got product market fit. And without that, if they ask for another 30 days, it's ho-hum. It's like, no, you don't have anything that they're just dying to have. So I would say those are some of the really practical aspects to getting it. But probably the biggest mistake, and this is where GTM is too loosely used and ill-defined, is you start scaling for growth before you've really nailed down your value hypothesis.
Yeah, I've seen that repeatedly, both in large organizations and smaller ones. We'll come back to that. Mark Lawn, who's a global C-suite executive and mentor, is pointing out, Donald, you have a great point. Being blindly fixated on your idea is problematic. Search for that internal dissenting voice that is your best critical friend. And I would challenge that a little more, not only your internal dissenting voice, but your customer's dissenting voice, and your board's dissenting voice, and your investors' dissenting voice. So we want people, of course, to be encouraging us on the journey, whether we're a multinational or we're a scrappy scale up, but we also want them to be saying, wait a minute, I mean, there's already something better in the market, or this, no one really cares about this. I'm thinking of the example of, CNN, for example, in the CNN Plus, $400 million in 30 days, more or less $13 million a day thrown away. But start with the question, who on earth said, I'm looking for more streaming news and I would love to pay for that. I mean, give me the name of one person on the planet that said that, because I don't think they exist, much less enough to cover this.
Scott, I'm sure they had a persona that said, wow, in this amalgamation of this unreal person that nobody could say, look, I want to talk to 5 of those kinds of people. I'm sure that they had a concoction of those that they made up. But I think what you're really getting at, it goes back to a couple of anecdotes that really affected me greatly early in my career. In my early 30s, Kirk Robb, who was then the CEO at Genentech, he told me, and I was a CFO at the time, so I hadn't yet gravitated toward all the way to the general management, executive CEO roles at that point. And he said, I require all of my direct reports to get out quarterly and talk to customers. And so, it's a bit of a geeky comment, but Hayek came up with this knowledge problem. And I think this is actually one of the, without going total geek in terms of, talking about Hayek, but one of the things that I think is really important, he said, is information exists in disparate partial pieces in the whole world we live in. And that's both inside the company and externally with customers and non-customers, partners, non-partners. And so part of what Kirk's advice led me to begin to think about is you've got to get, to use Steve Blank's comment, you got to get out of the building. But it's also the idea that you go out and you listen and you talk to people and you say, okay, what little nugget do they have or this one have? And then by doing enough of that, and I call it management by wandering around both internally and externally, what you're actually doing is you're inviting the connecting of the dots so you can gain insights that are unique to you. And to the point that was just made, inside the company, one of the most profound memories I have from my 20s before I got into management was how we, in the non-executive positions, we knew more about what was going on in the business than the executive team sometimes gave us credit for. And so when you're sitting here thinking about what's happening, and you're seeing an executive team that's not being intellectually honest about the state of the business, the state of the market, and what's going on, you kind of say, oh, that, there's a disconnect there, and that reduces the credibility of the management team. While the alternative, which is positive, says, why don't you engage in frank fashion with the employees as well as customers and ask, what are you hearing? So go talk to sales reps, travel with sales reps, talk to people in customer service. What's going on in the manufacturing floor? What else is happening anywhere? Because those are the hallway conversations where they have these tidbits of knowledge. And if you're going to connect all the pieces, you need to do that. And so what I did as a CEO in numerous companies, I formed what I called SWAT teams. And this was the idea that, 2 to 4 people, because the classic cases, people are disillusioned. Oh my God, nobody's listening to me, all that kind of good stuff that's very real. And what you do is you say, well, why don't you form a SWAT team? 2 to 4 people, you pick the topic, it has to be a single topic, and it's something that something about more than most. This really goes along the line of getting out to the edges and seeing what's going on in the margins so you can see these inflection points before they become too big. And so what happens is you're enabling them to go out and connect all the dots. You're starting hallway conversations among employees. You're then starting to have them say, well, boy, I can really make a difference here. And that's one of my key points that I wrote about most recently on LinkedIn, which is good people want to make a difference every day. Does your company let them? And the SWAT teams are a method for letting them.
Absolutely. Now we've got a bunch of questions here. I'm going to group some of them together. I've got Pex Para, who's writing into us from Colombia in Bogota. And he's asking, is this type of review something that's done in a cyclical matter, for example, yearly, or is this something you do more ad hoc? And then before you answer this, let me just put together a couple more questions for you, Donald. So Mark Lung is writing into us. He's an innovation coach and architect. And he's asking if the insight and ideas are on point, how do you get priority and overcome that organizational inertia, especially when you don't have agency? And I think that's an important point we need to look at. And then one more question that I'm going to put together with all of these. Jorg Hinder, who's an M&A and finance executive and CFO, he's writing, I guess a lot of customer testing goes on. And there's a lot of market intelligence that's invested in these 70% of product launches that fail. Can you share any insights why they fail despite that? So if we put those three questions together, because I think they're quite thematic, I'll let you run with that, Donald.
Well, thank you. Great question. Great questions. I scribbled them down so I wouldn't forget.
Yeah.
So I'm going to look down to make sure that I remember them. So let me start with Mark's comment. You get these insights, and this is where I think the CEO's role is really critical, and he or she should encourage strongly that their direct reports mimic their behaviors. And that is, you wander around and you ask, how are things going of people? You encourage the conversations with them where you're saying, like, tell me more, what's happening? And how can I clear a roadblock for you? And so what I have told my executive teams in the past years is that your job is to wander around and find out what blockers are inhibiting and denying the agency that Mark mentioned to the employees to get the right thing done that's clear. So you're both talking to them to learn what the issues are, but then you spend your time after that clearing the blocking moments for them. And so that's how you give them agencies. The SWAT teams are about agency as well, because you're not trying, you're stirring things up. I called it actually in a previous podcast, I called it constructive disruption. You're intentionally trying to stir things, not to create endless chaos, but enough that you don't get too siloed, you don't get too bureaucratic and structured. Now, in terms of the cyclical timing question, it's ongoing, it's dynamic, because you're going to have market feedback moments happening on a completely in a non-planned way. And so you've got to constantly be having a conversation with the marketplace, with the company people, connecting the two dots so that you can catch those things. Because if you don't, the inflection points can, good or bad, you can lose an upside and you can fall to a downside if you're not in a timely manner. So it's dynamic. And then in terms of the testing, this really goes back to what I was saying about rigorously defining the problems. So first off, a lot of companies don't actually solve for problems. They promote and evangelize solutions that they create. And they forget that the marketplace doesn't care about your company, your technology, or your products. What they care about is, will your offering help them get their job done better? Can they do more of their current job? Can they eliminate the imperfections in their ability to do their current job, or can they get a new job done? And if you don't have hard, rigorous thinking, where you've actually you keep diving into the particulars and saying, my goodness, what exactly is the customer struggling with? I think I have to tell you, because there's such a tendency for companies to rely on planning and calling it strategy and thinking that they come up with these internally generated plans which have these things, and so they go out and they do these hypotheses, testing, but it's biased. It's not really deep and rigorous. And I'll maybe throw in one other thing that's a couple of the minor but important hot buttons. You especially hear this in the SaaS company world. They'll talk about pick your ICP, your ideal customer profile, like there's a single ICP for a company. I mean, that basically says, okay, there's no market segments. We're just going to assume everybody's the same. Total nonsense. What you're going to have multiple customer profiles, and you're only going to be able to discern what those are if you rigorously define the problems and begin to see how this group of customers has this issue and this group of customer has this other issues. There may be some overlap, but there's going to be differences. Some will rate certain things as this is a really important factor for me, for which I'm not satisfied. And the others will have different rankings. And so you start to just ask yourself in the process of defining the customer's problems, can you rank them at that level and avoid, for all goodness sakes, avoid the superficial persona talk. So one of my things that I've done over the years, when somebody comes to me and says, well, you know, we've done this market research study and we have these personas, and I'd say, okay, I want to talk to 5 people of that persona. And what you'll very quickly find out is whether or not there actually is, it's a real job executor that has a real job they're trying to get done, or it's an amalgamation of a bunch of factors that make it completely useless.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got Aldo from Central Europe in business development. And he notes, actually goes, one fits all approach. Is that in the top 3? And then his question is, what is the most common mistake in go-to-market? So I mean, we could probably do a whole day session on this, but you know, what is the most common mistake you see in GTM?
So yes, do you have 3 hours? But since we don't, let's go straight to a couple thoughts. I think the core thing that companies do is they are too solution focused. When, as I said earlier, nobody cares about your offering unless it helps them get their job done. You know, Peter Drucker said the purpose of a corporation is to create a customer. You don't create a customer unless they feel that your offering is going to help them meet a need that's currently unmet in a meaningful way. And they'll only stay with you as long as nobody else comes along and does it better than you, which means you've got to keep asking yourself, how are we doing? The second thing, besides being too solution focused, because, you know, I can't tell you how many companies I've gone into and they say, well, you know, we got this really cool solution. And they start talking about all its features and benefits. And it's like, oh my goodness, nobody cares. Unless it meets these significant, rigorously defined unmet needs they are faced with. The second of 2 things I would highlight, Scott, to the question is executives frequently are seduced by the fake certainty of plans.
Yeah, agree. I see this a lot when we talk in strategy and people are laying out plans. They're saying, well, it's in the plan. It's like, well, yes, it's true. You have that in a plan and you've invested a lot of energy into that plan and investment, but the situation has changed. And not responding to that change in the situation is then leading to mismatches between potential customer expectations and the reality. And we can see that right now, for example, in the automotive industry. If we look what's going on in Europe with the OEMs, Volkswagen, Mercedes, and BMW, which are the 3 big German OEMs. And, you know, they usually run on 6 to 7 year planning cycles. Well, now the Chinese are coming in and Tesla's coming in and they're going, we're not doing 6 to 7 year planning cycles. We're doing 18-month planning cycles. And this has just thrown the whole market into total chaos, because if you're used to these very long programmed rollouts, and all of a sudden your competitor comes along and says, no, I'm just going to change things every 2 years. Or you have like a Musk at Tesla that says, well, I'll cut the sales price by 20%. That's very, very disruptive in what's been a market that has been relatively stable for quite some time. I just want to bring something in, and then Donald, we've got quite a few comments. It's a lively discussion going on here. Alan, who works on building models for the global economy, Alan Michaels is writing, and he says, and then I'm going to give my opinion and then let you speak. Go-to-market is so different if going to customers directly versus via a channel. So he's saying GTM for B2B is different than GTM for B2G or government contracts, for example. And here's what I'd say. I disagree. So I'm going to put you in the unfortunate position of being in the middle, but I think go-to-market is always the activity of understanding the needs of your customers and fulfilling those needs. And then how you manage the channels is obviously a different discussion, but I'll let you take that up. And Alan, it's a great comment and I disagree. So we'll go from there.
So I think I'm going to lean in your direction, Scott, for the following reason. It's what problems are you solving? And the solving isn't whether it's a B2B or a B2C customer. It's the fact that you're solving an unmet need that they are desperately seeking an answer to, and because there are no good alternatives. And so I think the more strategic question to ask is, what are the customers needing that they're desperate for, that need to be met and satisfied? And if you focus on that, I think you'll end up in a good place.
Right. Couple of things, and then we'll jump back into the comments. A lot of discussion going on about strategy and what is strategy, et cetera. For the record, my definition of strategy and our organization's definition of strategy is a framework of choices to determine the future purpose and path of the organization. So Mark and Naresh, just some comments there. But I want to now just bring this right back to GTM and talk about new developments. So what are the new developments in how people build successful GTM that you're seeing, Donald? And we hear so much about tools and technologies today. I don't want to turn this into a technology only discussion, but what do you see on the horizon and what's coming next in terms of go-to-market?
Well, there's a lot of talk about AI and about LLMs and machine learning and the like. And I think that still has to play out. But I think the way to think about it in terms of GTM is, if it helps you gather better and more information that brings greater clarity to customer unmet needs, so that you can both define them and test them rigorously, and then agree on them and then act on them. I think that's where things can become really powerful. And it's another way of saying you take the knowledge problem and you accelerate the ability to see things differently and act. And I'm going to go back, actually, Scott, to your auto industry thing, because what you're really describing is a significant inflection point where they, if they were picking up, if the German companies were picking up some of the marketplace leads, the guides, what's happening that maybe isn't publicly available, what trends are we starting to hear rumors about, then you can begin to say, all right, getting go-to-market right there is you're going to be flat-footed if you don't start to think about a go-to-market strategy that doesn't have 6 to 7 year timelines. And that then leads to, and this is the rigorous thinking of unmet needs, that's an insufficient, that's a first order observation. It's not conclusive. Likely the second and third order effects dominate over time, which is, okay, what do we have to do differently so we're no longer dependent on success being tied to 6 and 7 year timelines?
Yeah, that's a good point, is that how do you shift the timelines? And what are those weak signals, as Rita McGrath would talk about, that will show us that the market is changing? I've got quite a few questions here. I'm going to group some together so that we can do this. Someone's referring to, Naresh is referring to Roger Martin and how he talks about integrative thinking, which I know you know very well. Question coming in from Pex. Where do you see connections or differences between go-to-market and design thinking, considering both start with a customer's need and or problem to be solved? And then Naresh is asking, digital transformation, is this an enabler in go-to-market? So let's just put that all together and see what we come up with in the blender here. Well,
thank you. This is like a PhD oral exam. This is great. So I consider Roger Martin's made a number of great contributions to the literature and the way we think about things. I think his recent HBR video, I think it was last year, on how planning is not strategy. It's a 9-minute video. It's a must watch, because his whole comment is planning is a laudable list of activities that are under the control of the company, while strategy is envisioning a future that doesn't exist today, for which there's no data, but what you have to do is come up with a compelling story that engages customers and leads them to act. And so the integrative thinking that he talks about is the idea of how do you start to pull all these different pieces together? So what I've done is, I've zeroed in on a whole bunch of thought leaders around the world. And so Rita McGrath's, seeing around corners, inflection points, her discovery-driven planning stuff for the checkpoints, the top and bottom of the middle of the roadmap, and Roger Martin's thing about planning is not strategy. This is a huge problem. I actually think the planning is not strategy is a massive problem that people screw up. And so I would encourage people to think about how you integrate all the different pieces, and that really gets to some of the design thinking, where I tend to lean more heavily is I think that if the problem with design thinking, if you think about it too narrowly, is that you end up doing ideation stuff from potentially nowhere's land. And if you look at what Roger Martin says about integrative thinking, he's saying, take two competitive thoughts and pull the best ideas out of each of them and see if there's a combination in there that's really special and unique, and therefore you can design a different alternative. So I think that's entirely part of thinking about go-to-market right. And then digital transformation, it's not a technology story, it's a strategy issue. So you have to think about, it's a way to say, okay, now we've got access to data that we didn't have before that changes the nature of how things go to market. And we have ecosystems that are new that can lead to radical changes. And so you've got to just sit there and incorporate all of those different elements into your thinking.
Yeah, we've got a bunch of comments coming in, and then I want to go on to something a little bit different. Mark Lung, he's noting that business schools don't teach this. And then Alan Michaels is coming back to us very politely. Thank you, Alan. It's okay to disagree. He's saying, can I at least assume you both agree you should start with industry analysis? And I said, yeah, absolutely. You need to start with some kind of industry analysis to understand what the dynamics are. I would challenge a bit, though, that looking at how the industry has always done things is not necessarily good. And I'll give you an example. I did some work, with the fashion industry. And fashion industry, they said, well, this is the way things are done. And there's these collections and there's these seasons, and we do shows in Milan and New York and London and Hong Kong. And, that's just the way the business works. And then people like Zara come along and say, we're not going to do that. We're going to release new stuff every 2 weeks. And we have people in our stores, and they've got tablets, and they're monitoring what sells. And every morning we'll wake up in Zaragoza, Spain, and make new stuff and fly it out to our customers every day. So there are different ways to look at things. Let's talk, though, about discussing go-to-market, and we have a lot of executives and decision makers here on the line. You want to just discuss go-to-market with the board. What should you do? We're going to have a board meeting, and we're going to discuss go-to-market.
Well, actually, you're probably not going to discuss go-to-market, which is part of the problem. You're going to discuss a plan. So I have attended and participated in most cases, in recent years, led every board meeting for the 12 companies where I have held C-suite positions going back to 1985. So I have intensely strong opinions because I've seen pretty much every kind of board dynamic. The classic problem, and in my video series from the spring, I labeled the PowerPoints that are presented, because that's usually what most of it is performance art. It's like, you walk out of the meeting and you go, whew, we survived. And it's like, no, that's exactly the wrong mindset. Because if you think about how you want to engage, you want to spend time with your board talking about the assumptions. What do you know? What are your thinkings about the unmet customer needs? Why do you think that? What does that lead to in terms of a compelling value proposition? So to go back to the idea of checkpoints, these assumptions have to play out by this date, or we need to revisit the topic. So I propose dedicating a portion of each board meeting to stepping out of the planning, because Mark's right. The business schools don't teach it. Strategy firms don't teach it. The GTM stuff. Nobody teaches it. Boards, investors, they talk about, well, we need a plan. We need an updated plan. And, no, what you need to do is talk about what's going on dynamically in the marketplace so that you're bringing the board along on the journey that the management team is having. And I'd argue there's 2 points where that breaks down. The first is I don't always find that the management team is thinking rigorously enough about defining unmet customer needs and value propositions and key assumptions. And so you sort of can't expect the board to be brought along if the initiatives with the interactions with the board are shallow. So what I say is take the key assumptions, force the management team to really clarify those 3 factors. Do we have an understanding of unmet customer needs? Do we understand our critical assumptions? Do we have a compelling value proposition? What's our business model? Talk to the board about what you've learned since the last quarterly board meeting. Invite a dialogue, because if you don't do that, you're going to be traipsing along hoping, and hope's not a strategy. And sometime in the future, you're going to hit a real bump in the road. And then you're going to have to go back to the board and say, well, we didn't test this a year ago, and we could have, should have. You probably wouldn't even say that to the board, but oh my God, what are we going to do now? And so now you've just really ticked off your board members and investors because you haven't really been intellectually honest about the nature of what you're trying to do and getting go-to-market right.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk now. We've got quite a few people from funds on the line, so they could be limited partners, general partners, or they're working with funds. If you're a management team or you're a fund, how should you do? I'm talking about a buyout fund or a VC fund that's going to invest. How should you talk about or think about go to market? Particularly, let's take the case of a scale up. So we don't have that much data yet. It's not General Motors or Apple. So how do we do this, or what should we be talking about as a GP or as a founder in order to make this a valuable discussion?
So the way I define due diligence, which is really the dialogue that occurs, whether it's a formal fundraising moment or it's an in-between moment between an investor and a company's management team, is it's a dialogue. And it's a dialogue about 3 core questions that a business school classmate of mine, Bill Reichert, highlighted is, what do you do better than anyone else? How are we different? And why should I be believed? And if you can answer those questions in the context of going back to that 3x3 GTM roadmap and addressing the topics that really matter, that's going to allow a dialogue that will over time allow you to be persuasive, because things will play out and you can go back to them and say, remember when we told you about this hypothesis? We went out and tested it and validated. Remember this unmet need? We've now rigorously defined it and we've got something, and that's why we're developing this solution. And here's what's going on in the marketplace. And I want to go back to something that was about the disagreement that we had about the industry stuff. Industry boundaries are now fluid and disruptible in ways they never were. And what matters is getting the customer's job to be done right, because that transcends industry boundary conditions that then sometimes evaporate. Think of Apple getting into the music business. Who would have predicted that? And that's the way that you can, by focusing on the job to be done, you can really enable the ability to stay current as disruptions happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple of questions I'm going to put together here. We've got about 8 minutes left, so please feel free to keep putting questions in the comments. Mr. Dobruki from Poland is asking us, what would be your advice to connect GTM with action? And then I want to put that together with a question from Henrik Amstutz in Norway, who's asking, do you have any general career advice? Looks like he's an early stage VC. So if we put those together, let's see what we can do.
So in terms of the connecting with action, again, these are great questions. And what you do is you say, look, you have to get out in the marketplace. Remember, you're trying to confirm a value hypothesis. GTM is first a value hypothesis that confirms you're creating value for customers. And secondly, it's a growth hypothesis that says, look, we're going to scale this thing now that we have something firmly proven that the customer should care about. And so what you have to do is you say, have we started early enough? So the great companies that I've talked to over the years, they married a technologist and a marketing person at the very beginning when they had a raw, unproven technology and an unvalidated hypothesis about an unmet market need. And it never stopped until they either killed the project because it wasn't going to become a product, or they retired the successful product. And so what you have to do is you have to have that mindset that says, we're going to keep asking these questions. And then in terms of the VC and stuff, I think if you just start to really focus on what customer problems are we solving, you can't go wrong with that question. And so what I do when I'm talking to executives is I'll say, do you have an understanding of the unmet customer needs? So when you're interviewing a management team, ask them one-on-one. When you have a chance to separate them, say, what do you think the top 3 customer needs are? What are the top 3 customer profiles and their top needs? See if they give the same answer. I would predict in a huge number of companies, there is not an agreement among the management team on exactly what the key unmet needs are. And that's a way to sort of advance the conversation in a very pragmatic way and say, if we can't answer those questions, we don't have any basis for figuring anything else out after this. It's all built on sand.
Yeah, absolutely. One last question, and then I'm going to move to closing out. Marcus, who's actually based in between Germany and Boston, so kind of close to both of us, Donald, he's asking, what are your thoughts on the idea that we have lost focus on customers due to institutional navel gazing, which is a mindset issue that needs correction? And then he say, once we address this honestly in our companies, our thinking and actions will most likely, maybe even automatically change. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that touches on what I said earlier about an intellectual honesty from the management team. CEO sets the tone. The management team sets the tone. Read the article. It's in the MIT Sloan Review by Jeff Dyer and Nathan Furr, because what they talk about how is if you want to liberate people and really get the substantive stuff going, it starts with being intellectually honest about the state of the business, the state of the industry, the state of the economy. And that is the predecessor event to creating psychological safety, because then everybody can talk about what's really going on, because the executive team is showing that they're being honest about both the good news and the bad news.
So I'm going to go down to something that I've heard a few times, and it's coming up more often. We have this concept of VUCA, and the world is rather volatile at the moment, although I would argue that the world is always volatile. We just feel it more at some points than other. But, people say, I don't have time for planning, or there's no point to do strategy and go to market because things are changing so quickly. The environment is too volatile or uncertain. What would your answer be to that?
I think the answer is something you said to me a few weeks ago. If you don't have time for strategy, do you have time for bankruptcy? And it's you just have to deal with reality. I mean, I agree with you that, there may be elements of the marketplace that are more vulnerable and volatile than they have been in the past, but other things may be less. You can't predict that. So the way you handle that is you say, look, we're going to be a disciplined group of people with disciplined thinking and disciplined actions. We're going to rigorously go after the issues, and we're going to make it a running dialogue. So part of what the problem of planning, a planning mindset, is you think of these episodic moments where you address issues instead of it being an everyday conversation where you're gathering an anecdote and you're figuring out what it means because you're connecting the dots.
Yeah, absolutely. So for all the people that are watching this live, and for those that will be watching a recording later, Donald, is there a website? I mean, obviously people can connect with you here on LinkedIn. They can follow your posts, etc. But is there a website or somewhere you suggest they go for more information and stimulus on this?
I actually think the best place to go is the featured posts on my LinkedIn profile, because
Okay.
what you'll find is I did a podcast in the spring, and I took the video from that podcast and I broke it up into 17 different video segments on go-to-market, and then wrote in the underneath the show more, underneath the YouTube video, I wrote a thought piece related to that video. That is the best way to get my latest thinking on go-to-market issues.
Well, thank you. This is Donald Hawthorne with Go-to-Market Strategies based in Boston, USA. I'm Scott Newton, Managing Partner at Thinking Dimensions Global Consulting, based near Venice and Milan, Italy. It's been a wonderful session. I appreciate the really dynamic and lively questions and discussion. Donald, thank you for all your time. To all the people that took an hour out of their agenda today to log in with us, some of them as far away as Hong Kong and Singapore, some of them as close to us as Milan and Boston, and everything else in between. Thank you. Grazie, gracias, obrigado, she. I won't butcher any more languages today, other than to say I wish you all the best of luck. Not the best of luck, the best of success in your go-to-market. Donald, any ending words that you want before we sign out?
Keep thinking about it as a dynamic journey and nail your value hypothesis before you do your growth hypothesis.
Wonderful. Thanks to everyone. Let's continue the discussion in the comments and chat. And LinkedIn Live, we appreciate you hosting this today on the platform.
Thank you all for joining us.